So thank you for setting aside some time for this afternoon. I'm going to record the meeting just so that it's available to those who couldn't make it. And if there's something you want to go back to, I wish I could promise that it would be so riveting that you're going to want to watch it over and over again like a good movie, but I doubt that's the case. What I'm going to do is go ahead and mute everyone for now as we go through, and then as there's an opportunity to, we might, I would say if you have questions along the way, throw them in the chat window in Zoom. And I'm going to try to move quickly through it again so that we cover a fair amount and stick to the time that I promised, which was about an hour. So hopefully we'll wrap up around 12:30. If you have to drop off, that's fine, because like I said, we're recording it and we'll make it available to everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and switch up screens. And hopefully everyone can see my shared screen now. So this is something we've talked about with everyone for some time, this documentation that's going to be necessary for NIST. I know a number of you have done sessions with the RIC or with P&W BOCES, and so everyone at least has some general familiarity with what NIST is, but we're going to touch on it just briefly today. So some of it might be repetitive based on what you've gone over in the past, but what we're going to wrap up is really in the documentation that we're looking to use with everybody. And a number of you have already submitted POs, and I think I sent everybody who had submitted POs, I sent a copy of their documentation in a Dropbox link today. So this is where we get started with it. So I know we had a couple other folks just joining up with us, but as I mentioned, we'll record this so that we can make it available to everybody after the fact. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation here. So this is what I had sent out in the email to everyone, was our hope or objectives for at least what we'd like to accomplish over the summer, if not leading into, I would say, the beginning of September. And the reason for that is we know that there's going to be a measure of professional development linked to this. And so we want to at least get you that far so that going into September, you have an idea of things that you're going to want to review with staff and things that might affect them. So today we're going to get started on just a general understanding of the documentation, what NIST documentation is and what the requirements are, a little bit of what the language looks like, and how we're looking to attack it going forward. Because for as much as you may have your policies in place for everything else, there's this requirement in Ed Law 2D that you adopt this NIST cybersecurity framework. And I apologize if you hear, of course we start a seminar and my landscaper shows up and the dog is barking. So that just adds to the flavor of our meeting today. So I apologize for that. Just so you have it, I'll share this PowerPoint with everyone too, but just two good resources. One is the NIST.gov website. In particular, this link goes right to a video, an hour-long video that describes NIST 1.1. I'll give the leaf blower a moment to go by here. Sorry about that. The other link is to Compliance Forge, which is the company that does the documentation templates that we're really endorsing and recommending. We've worked with them in the past. You'll see that they're very comprehensive and they do a lot of the legwork for you and the heavy lift, so it makes things easier going forward. But you'll have these links just so that you have a way to get to these resources after the fact as well. So as you know, NIST is this big term that's getting thrown around when it comes to Ed Law 2D and the fact that you have to adopt these, this whole cybersecurity framework. NIST is a branch of the US Department of Commerce, interestingly enough, with a focus on a number of standards surrounding technology, and they are the ones that put together the NIST cybersecurity framework. There are other NIST standards as well that go well beyond it, but we obviously have to live under the umbrella of the NIST cybersecurity framework. There are other standards organizations. You'll hear of things like ISO, which is the International Standards Organization. They're big in technology. There are other organizations like IEEE, which is who puts out Ethernet and Wi-Fi standards and things like that. So there's all these consortiums and entities and organizations that are involved in creating standards surrounding technology. NIST happens to be the one that's connected to the government, the federal government, and it's what a lot of the states are now adopting as the kind of base standard that municipalities and public organizations have to live under. The cybersecurity framework is one of their standards that they work with. And as mentioned, since there's this desire for the general public to protect data and individual security, the cybersecurity framework forms a baseline standard by which organizations can live up to a measure of cybersecurity, and at least know when dealing with other organizations that they're all meeting a certain benchmark. And so it's understandable that the government, and especially the state, would want schools to adopt something and not just leave it up to you to invent whatever you want. The idea that we all adopt this at least foundation of cybersecurity and an approach to it. Now, it is a living document. They're on to version 1.1 now, and eventually there'll be 2 and 3 and so on as things evolve. And there'll be minor changes to the framework over time. So this is something that's not a set it and forget it forever thing. It's going to be something that we constantly monitor, similar to other requirements that we get from the state and federal government. How does it compare to other standards or frameworks that exist? I thought this was an important little graphic, and some of you have seen this. I may have shown it to you, but it just helps you to understand where we exist in the world of standards and frameworks that exist surrounding cybersecurity. The NIST cybersecurity framework is actually towards the very low level of standards. Now, that's not a bad thing, because when you think about everything that we're going to have to implement, if we had to be on the far right of this graphic here, it might be overwhelming to try to implement the measures that maybe the Department of Defense is required to implement. That's more along the lines of like the NIST 800-53 standard. So for as much as this is a unfunded mandate and we have to just sort of adopt this, it's not that bad. There's a measure of documentation, but we're going to see and show you how we can do that in an easy way, the least amount of work possible. But we just don't want you to feel overwhelmed by this whole approach. If anything, this is a really good thing for us all to be doing. It benefits everybody. It allows us to, when we present things to the board and to your public, we can not just say we made up these procedures. No, these are nationally adopted and backed frameworks and standards that we're adopting as a district. So this is a good thing. It's a little bit of work, but it's going to be valuable to everybody. This is a little breakdown of how the cybersecurity framework is designed within NIST. And there's these core functions that everything's broken into: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And if you really dig into the way that the cybersecurity framework is built, you'll understand how they organize the language and all of these different components. And you'll see how there's a core component, then subcomponents, and then it gets very granular from there on. But something as simple as identifying, when you think of asset management, identifying is your inventory, knowing what you have, both from an asset standpoint, but also from a data standpoint, the type of data that you collect. Then things like when you get down to the level of protecting, okay, these are procedures and systems that we have in place to ensure that that data and that information is safe. Detecting, what tools do we have in place to identify anomalies and risks and things like that. And then how do we respond and how do we recover? So we have a full cycle of events when it comes to this framework. So the idea is that the CSF, or the cybersecurity framework, is not just a set of documents, it's a program that we're adopting. Documentation is a big piece of it, but hand in hand with the documentation is everyone understanding the program and living within it. And that's why we mentioned early on that there's a goal to develop a measure of professional development, not just for the IT staff and the tech directors and maybe the people that manage student information systems or software, but really everyone is involved in this. Any users will have to have a measure of training associated with this framework so that we're all living within this umbrella. And if we do that, then we can formally call it a program. And so that's something we'll discuss in some of our future meetings, is how we mature through this program. But I just wanted to give you a taste of some of these components. So this brings us to Compliance Forge, which we've been throwing around this name for some time with a number of you folks. And Compliance Forge is a vendor. They do documentation. They're a small company, but they've been in this game for a number of years. And they develop documentation templates that range from 75 to 95% complete, meaning you only need to do 25 to even 5% customizing to make it your own. And what they do is they develop documentation for a number of standards and frameworks. That graphic that we showed before that showed kind of weaker to strong programs, they develop software that covers the whole gamut, or not software, documentation that covers the whole gamut. In our case, we're just looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework. So in the world that we live in, for as much as they have all of these document sets that I'm showing on the screen, things like their written information security program, their digital security program, incident response programs, continuity of operation plans, they have a number of document sets. They break it up into individual components because they realize that there's such overlap amongst the different frameworks and programs that a number of the standards organizations develop. So instead of developing a full package just for NIST cybersecurity framework or just ISO, 1027, those type things, they developed components and then they pick the components that fit whatever standard you need to live under. So for our sake, living under the cybersecurity framework with NIST, there's two core components that we're going to start with, and that's the Written Information Security Program, or WISP, and the Cybersecurity Standardized Operating Procedures document. So a few of you have already seen this. A few of you that have already cut POs, we've sent you copies of it this morning. This is what we're going to be digging into. Now, to fully live in the NIST cybersecurity world or cybersecurity framework world, to have a completely mature program, technically there are other documents that we'll have to develop. But at that point, it may be that we already have pieces of them. So for instance, a incident response program and a continuity of operations plan, or what we used to call the disaster recovery plan. You may have pieces of those documents already. So our thought was, before jumping all the way into those, let's see what we have and work from there. There's other things too eventually that we'll have to make sure we have addressed. Things like a risk management program and a risk assessment program. We may find that down the road, as we mature in this program, that instead of doing that in-house, that's the component that maybe gets outsourced to a third party. We've talked about companies like Blue Orange or Core BTS that are doing compliance assessments and things like that. That's a component that we're likely, as we continue to mature together in this, we're going to say that might be a third party that's doing that, so that we're getting a true unaltered, independent, outside view and assessment of our risk level. But then there are other components that we may have to address as well, things like a vendor compliance program. Imagine we're living under NIST CFS, cybersecurity framework, but now what about our vendors? So for instance, Edutech. Well, Edutech is adopting this at the same time you are. So Edutech is covered, but now we look at another organization, BOCES, or we look at the RIC, or we look at someone else that's exchanging data with us. It's software manufacturers. You're dealing with this already when it comes to getting parent bill of rights and data compliance documentation together from some of the software manufacturers, but we're going to have to develop some formal documentation internally to address the fact that we have a program for managing vendor compliance. There's also vulnerability patch management. Some of these will become systems, but there is a measure of documentation that we may need to put together. But as we mentioned, for now, we're looking at this WISP document and the CSOP document, because that's going to form the core or the baseline of everything we're going to need. So that's why we're going to start with these. So the Written Internet Security Program and the Cybersecurity Standardized Operating Procedures. Now, to give you an idea of how these documents are developed, Compliance Forge uses this hierarchical documentation model. It's the way they show it, though, is in my mind a little bit backwards, and we're going to see what that is. But you see at the very bottom are the policies. And the policies are the high level, written out requirements of what's going to occur in this program. And it's really the policies. Now, in a school, we throw around that term policy. These are not necessarily board adopted policies because this is likely not to become public domain. We don't necessarily want to publish portions of our cybersecurity plan, because that would be counterintuitive to make that available to people publicly. We want to keep this safe and protected because it's obviously a security related document. But the policies are a higher level. And the policies we'll get to later are what you're going to likely do most of your PD around, to make people aware of the policy so they have a sense of what they are and what their intent is. But as we look at these two documents, this WISP document and this CSOP document, just want to show you where they fall into this hierarchy. The WISP document is really the higher level document and outlines, one, the policy, and two, really the standard that that policy is fulfilling or living up to. So when we think about the NIST cybersecurity framework, that's the standards for the most part. There are other standards that apply. You think of HIPAA regulations and things like that. So as we go through the document, you'll see that there are links and cross-references to other standards that those policies address. And that's not a bad thing. If anything, we're covering ourselves for some of these other standards that maybe we didn't realize we fell under. There may be other standards that come down, in future dates that we'll have to adjust to. But the benefit of this is that we're taking policies that are cross-referenced to specific standards. In our case, the primary being the NIST cybersecurity framework. Now, the reason why I said this document is I feel like it is a little backwards, is that this is typically how I look at it, meaning the policies really sit at the very top. They are what the whole district is going to have to be aware of. The board needs to be aware of. You need to be really versed in the policies. That is the core of the whole thing. How we implement those, when we get down to what we're called the procedural pieces of it, that is the day-to-day IT operations. So your IT people, and we have our operations managers on with us today, and they'll be an integral part in this whole process. We inherit the procedural components, and the procedural components are the most protected of the documents. We don't want anyone to see those outside of those directly involved, meaning the tech director and the IT staff. The reason for that is those procedural documents are going to outline the very specific things we have in place to protect data, to secure data, how we do it, when we do it, what we encrypt, how we encrypt. So you can imagine that's a very secure document. We don't want other people to see it because it would basically give them the engineering plan for our security system for data. So that's why I kind of flipped this over. We think at the top are the policies. And that's where we're really going to begin most of our work together on this. So digging into it, we talked about this WISP, Written Internet Security Program. This is the core document that is going to branch out into everything necessary to document a fully compliant NIST cybersecurity framework program. So we're going to get right into that now. I'm going to bring that document up so you can get a little taste of it. And as we go along, if you have a question or want me to slow down or go back to something, go ahead and throw it in the chat, or there's even a raise hand function in Zoom if you want to use it. And we can go ahead and unmute you and you can ask your question that way. Because I know I'm moving kind of quickly, but this is sort of the meat of what I wanted to get into with everyone. So this document is the Written Information Security Program, or WISP. Now what I'm showing you is the copy that's Edutatex, and this is basically a raw copy of it, the way you would receive it from Compliance Forge. So for the handful of districts that have already cut POs because they were able to use year-end funds, this is what you're going to get, and it's going to say your name on it, the name of the district. And this document, for the most part, there's almost zero there's almost nothing in the way of work you have to do to make this your own. As I scroll through this document, we'll just go through the first section, which is basically an outline of, I'll get to it here, how the document is written. So you see in this introduction here, this whole section, once everybody's familiar with it, can potentially be removed when we're done. Outside of wanting to make it available to people that might read the document, like board members and things like that. It's basically an introduction to the way Compliance Forge generates or outlines their documents, the type of language that's used, things like that. You'll notice that there's a couple of key terms in here as well. So some of this you may want to leave in the document. You could leave all of it, You could delete as much of it as you like, but it basically outlines the way this document's going to work. So for the sake of, as you make notes of things that you're going to want to do once you get a copy of the document, you're really going to want to study this section because it's going to give you an idea of how they write their policies. And everybody's a little different in their approach to writing a policy. But this outlines the way these are written so that if we ever have to add to it, we can follow that same methodology in order to keep things consistent. Then we get into the structure, and this is that same graphic that we showed before, but it outlines the way each of these pieces work. So this document, as we mentioned, sits down in the policy section of it, and it's going to outline each of the policies necessary to meet the cybersecurity framework requirements. Right? It's also going to outline a little bit of the control objectives, which is what we want to result from those policies, our goal in it. And then it's also going to define the standard that that policy meets. So let's look at an example of that. We'll start with the first section, security and privacy governance. And we'll get right to the first policy. So in this case, just understand this is written from the perspective of EduTech. So it uses the acronym ET to represent EduTech when you see that here. Now I'll try to zoom in a little bit. I know it might not be the easiest to read on the screen, but we'll share copies of this as well with everyone so you have it. Every policy is written the same way. So in this case, there's a management intent. Purpose of this is to specify the development, proactive management, and ongoing review of EduTech security and privacy program. Then we have our very specific policy. EduTech shall protect the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and safety of its data and systems. It goes on, everything else. It then references the supporting documentation. Now, these are the control objectives that fulfill that policy or are tied to it. So if something as simple as, first one, publishing security and privacy policies. We establish, maintain, and give out these policies as necessary. Here's our standard. EduTech security and privacy policies are represented in a consolidated document. It goes on. You'll notice every so often there's a cross-reference or a footnote. We see number 7 here. Let's scroll down to the bottom of the page. You'll notice under number 7, it's referencing the very specific NIST component. So that takes us way back to our graphic that I showed early on in our presentation of those core components of NIST. Well, those core components break down into subcomponents and then into even further subcomponents. These cross-references go back to each of those. So that if we ever get audited and someone says, well, does this comply with NIST cybersecurity framework? We can show them, look, every policy is documented and it cross-references the requirement in the NIST cybersecurity framework. Done. You'll notice there's a whole host of other frameworks and standards that it also meets. So when we think of things like HIPAA or other things, we're pretty well covered with this document set. Now, if we had to go another step up maybe on that ladder of stronger cybersecurity programs, yeah, there may be other policies we need to add to this, and that might be a different version of this document. But for as far as we know, it's really only living within the NIST cybersecurity framework world. So we're comfortable with this set of policies. So let's just go back to it. Now, as we look at the way this is written, we'll go to one that's a little less generic. Let's go to something like asset management. So the policy itself is straightforward and fairly clear. EduTech shall protect its assets and data by implementing and maintaining appropriate IT asset management. These documents are full of acronyms. So in this case, the ITAM, I feel like everything's an acronym in this. Don't be overwhelmed by that. But this policy is stating that we're going to have an inventory program basically and why we're going to have it. It gets into some of the objectives that clarify that with some specificity what we want to do with that inventory. We obviously want to have an accurate reflection of what we have. We want to have a measure of granularity when it comes to tracking and reporting on it, things like that. You then get into some of the specific standards, how it's going to be hosted, what's included, things like internal and external owned assets, list of company approved products, things like that. There's some guidelines. Now the guidelines are not specific to NIST, but are more generic, and they're not something you have to live by. So when we think about language, there's the policy that we adopt. So obviously we have to find a way to live up to that policy. There's the control objective, which aligns with the NIST framework, which really explains what we're trying to accomplish with the policy. There's the set standard that we have to meet, that we're going to measure ourselves against. And then there are guidelines. Now, the guidelines really just give us some coaching. We don't necessarily have to live up to a guideline. They are more like suggestions. So as you go through the document, you'll start to see kind of top down. I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to, oh, I get to a guideline. You know, maybe we want to do this, but we may not be able to. That's okay. So just kind of helping you see where we have to live as you go through these documents. Something like in this section, network diagrams, how we handle the removal of assets. All of these tie back to this one policy that we are going to protect our assets and data by implementing some sort of asset management program. Okay? So the policies are fairly basic. What you'll notice in this document is, and this is where, if you want to make a mental note about how to develop some PD surrounding this document, this whole document is roughly 73 pages. So it's not overwhelming, but you're not going to review 73 pages of this language with all of your staff. What you can do, though, is at the very end of the document, there is an appendix that's a summary of all of the individual policies. So if you're making a note of how do I start thinking about PD, my recommendation is that this is what you're going to want to look at as a way to outline, not necessarily reviewing all of it, but this is sort of the cheat sheet to the NIST policies that we're going to have to deal with. So for instance, you'll see that asset management policy. It's right here, same as it was before. I'll zoom in a little bit so everybody can see it. You start getting through each of these: compliance management, configurations, monitoring, classifying data, endpoint security. So each one of these, if we just took this whole section, and I know this left-hand side might be a little small to see, but there's roughly, maybe there's 25 or 30 like core policies that make up our entire program. So again, our goal is to make this not overwhelming. So this approach to it, we think, is the safest, most direct approach to getting some documentation that will, one, survive an audit, but that's just kind of the baseline. That's the bare minimum, surviving an audit. No, we want something that's going to actually be a livable document, meaning something we can live up to and legitimately understand and implement. So any questions so far on this? Just feel free to unmute yourself or raise the hand, and I see some shaking heads now. So, okay, good. As long as everybody's okay and able to see this all right. I'm going to go back to something like asset management. Okay, let's go up to asset management. As I mentioned in the document here, right now we've just been talking about this WISP, Written Internet Security Program. We recommended in this bundle not just getting the WISP document, but also this other CSOP document. And I just want to show you briefly what that is and how they link to each other. Just so we're all on the same page as to the workload, what we're going to have to do, and who's going to be involved in it, and things like that. So this WISP document, I'll go to the very beginning. For the most part, this document is what you as tech directors are going to it's going to become your, for lack of a better term, Bible. It's what you're going to live by. It's your code, your motto for everything you do in the district. And hopefully you find that it's written on at least a high enough level where it's not overwhelming. And it's written in a way that will be fairly easy to translate to other people, like training staff, making the board aware of some of the things that are happening and why we make certain decisions. But this is where you're going to live most of your time. The CSOP document, for as much as you're highly involved in it, is for the most part going to affect the day-to-day operations of the IT staff, as well as some of your users. So let me give you an example. So let's go to one of these policies or control objectives. Let me find a good one here. All right, so identification and authentication. This is basically talking about user management. So this is the policy, high level, that we're going to implement the principle of least privilege with logical access control mechanisms so that only authorized users can gain access to EdTech systems. Basically, we're going to manage users. That's what this policy is saying. If I flip over to the CSOP document now, right, this is now going to get into the specifics of our procedures associated with that policy and how we're going to live up to that policy. So let me scroll down to that section. Here we go. Identification and authentication. Let me put these side by side. And we'll zoom out. And we'll get rid of this. And we'll get rid of this. I know I'm filling up the screen quite a bit here, and I apologize for that. I just want to show you how these two documents fit into each other. So this is the WISP document on my left, had the policy, okay, identification and authentication. On my right, the CSOP document. These are specific procedures associated with that. So let's go ahead and get a little more into this. Some of the sections of this document can get hidden or just taken out. It depends on how granular you want to get with the documentation. For instance, everything you see highlighted in yellow in this document doesn't necessarily have to be here. It just gives you placeholders for more information. So something as simple as like identifying a specific process owner for this, or a target for performance on how you're going to measure it. My recommendation is that we're not going to delete these yellow sections, but we'll probably hide them or just gray them out or something, because they are steps that we might get to as this program matures over time. So it's likely not version 1 of your district's NIST cybersecurity framework program. It might be version 4 or 5 as the program really gets mature. But I just want you to understand what they were and the fact that this whole section, not necessary. It can be just grayed out, it could be deleted, but it's good to know it's there as a placeholder for more granular information that you may want to add down the road. Okay, so let's look at something like the procedure for user provisioning. It has a control objective, it has a control, and then it has a very specific procedure and control activity. So for instance, as you go through the procedures, it's going to start identifying roles and responsibilities. Now this is, so far, everything we talked about pretty much involved zero work on your part to develop a documentation for your district. The name of the district is already on the document, that WISP document. You can basically take that, read it, and just put it on the shelf. That's basically done. When we get into this document, this is where we have to do a little more work, because you'll notice it starts to identify roles and responsibilities. Well, at some point in this document, we're going to have to put names with those roles and responsibilities. It's going to start talking about specific software or systems that we use to implement this procedure. We're going to have to write that down, and I'll show you there are sections for that. Even still, it's not that much work from the standpoint of documentation. The work is more on the level of reading this, studying it, understanding it, and adopting it in practice and starting to change the way we do things. That's the heavy lift portion of this. So it's less the documentation. Documentation is pretty much written outside of filling in some names and places and things like that. It's the heavy lift is getting everyone on board to actually live by these procedures, and also acknowledge procedures that we just can't do, either because we can't afford to do it, we don't have the staff to do it, it doesn't meet the production environment that we're in from the standpoint of the reality. So some of these things that we read, when it comes to like passwords, things like that, you may say, well, a kindergartner can never do this in practice. That's okay. That's part of the risk assessment and risk acknowledgement that goes into these documents as well. And we're going to touch on that in just a few minutes. I'll just take you through one of these sample procedures. It gets a little more specific into the fact that we implement different administrative and technical means to provide least privileged access to things and what that means, how often we review it. These are all things that we've all talked about wanting to do, And I readily admit, as a company, as your IT people, we've always wanted to do these things. But none of us have ever really lived up to them because something else always came up, something else became a priority, a project or something else. The benefit, and just always remind yourself of this, the silver lining in all this is being forced to live in this NIST cybersecurity framework and having someone else tell us that we have to do it. For as much as it's unfunded and nobody has time for it, it allows us to prioritize things that often got, put on the shelf before. And the good part about this is that it's forcing us to prioritize things that frankly will help us sleep better at night. Things like knowing that we're reviewing on a regular routine basis user privileges and things like that, that we're running a report and reviewing it as a team to ensure that there are not, orphaned accounts that could all of a sudden be used to compromise the district. That will help all of us sleep better at night. So that's the positive aspect of this. It is a workload. We're all going to have to adjust how we do things, but it's very, very good from the standpoint of all being on the same page and at least being able to say to everyone in the public, we're measuring up to this standard. And if there's areas where we can't, this is why. That allows us to deal with the ramifications of an issue when something does come up. Because even in a perfect world, if we're fulfilling every obligation in this, we can still have a breach of data. We could still have something happen accidentally where a user does something they shouldn't do. Systems can fail, you name it. But at least we are protecting ourselves from looking negligent or seeming like we weren't doing what we should be doing. That's the benefit of a framework or standards in this case. And that's why it's beneficial to all of us to move into this world. So that's, like I said, nobody wants to have to do one more thing, but there's a value for all of us in doing this. And it really does raise the level that everybody is at. So just scrolling through this, you see something like account management. It gives us an idea of what's involved in it, identifying account types, the conditions for group membership. As we go through these documents, what'll happen is, and I'll refer to some homework at the end of this seminar today, but part of the process of going through the documents is going to be highlighting sections of these procedures that, one, we already do. So maybe we'll say we're going to highlight those in green. There'll be sections where we have a rough idea that we're doing it. Maybe those are highlighted in yellow. There's going to be sections where we know we're not doing it, we need to be doing it, and those we're going to highlight in red. Then there's sections that maybe are question mark as to whether or not they're realistic for us. And maybe we highlight those in gray or something else. That whole process of going through this and highlighting and assessing what we're doing right now in line with these established, framework aligned procedures, that process is basically our first internal risk assessment. And it's something that we can call our risk assessment for this year, because we will basically outline, we have all the procedures that NIST requires. They're all in this document. It's very easy for us to go through this. And part of the education of learning those procedures is we're going to go through and say, wow, I've never done this before, or wow, I didn't realize we have to do this, or, oh yeah, we do this, this is our normal procedure. That will help us assess where we are and what needs to be adjusted, what things are brand new, what things are just slight tweaks. And again, compiling that information will really help us with, in the fall, being able to look at it and say, here's our first risk assessment. These are the areas that are red, all right, of those items, which are the most critical. And we'll be able to assess that. And we'll be able to say, okay, this is our roadmap now to getting to green on everything, how we mature the plan. So that's our recommendation for approaching this. And we appreciate everyone's feedback on this, because this is just our thought in a sort of efficient way to go about adopting this and implementing it and assessing where we are, because it's a plan that you're not going to just be mature in. You can't just walk. We have to crawl first with this. And part of that crawling process is learning the program. Part of learning the program, the easiest way to do that is by really reviewing established documentation, which is what we have from Compliance Forge. So that's going to be the process. I just want to show you one little piece of this document at the end, and then maybe we'll open up for a couple questions briefly. But as I go through this whole doc, let's see if I can view my outline here. Just a moment here. As I get down to the appendix, as you go through this document, most of the edits, with the exception of us highlighting what we need to work on and making notes on it, from the standpoint of adopting it as your procedures and putting it on the shelf, most of the edits will occur in the appendices. So as we look at things like available tools and services, this is a section where we as your IT staff will go through and identify some of the systems we use. What's our backup? Okay, we have a Barracuda backup. This is the information on it, the description of it. What do we use for endpoint protection? Okay, we're using FortiNet endpoint protection. We're using Forta EDR for protecting against malware and zero-day threats and things like that. We're going to outline those here, and this section might change from time to time. Every year, maybe we're reviewing this to ensure that okay, we have the list of tools that we're using. Then there are things like naming the key stakeholders. And you'll notice this is where we start having to do a little bit of work. Now, this NIST framework is written as if you are an organization of 20,000 people, and your IT department, and specifically your cybersecurity department, is 150 people. That's not the case. We're teams of 3, 4, 5 people maybe. Maybe if we extend it out to some of the data staff at a district, maybe there's 10 or 12 people involved. So a lot of the names are going to be the same. So it's going to say, Darlene in a few of these spots. It's going to say Caitlin in a few of these spots. It's going to say the Edutech staff and some of those people in a few of these spots. Again, it's not overwhelming, but there are a number of hats that we each will have to wear. And that's why it's important for us to go through this part at some point. Not so difficult, but we'll get through it. But you see how there's a number of spots that need to just get filled in with a title and description of who the person is. Okay, let me show you another little section here. Building off of that, those were key stakeholders. Some of those are not, when they say key stakeholders, not necessarily that they are involved in these procedures. They're just other people that may be involved as well. Now you get into the roles and responsibilities for cybersecurity. This is quite a few. So as we go through this, you'll see all of these work role IDs. Again, most of these are going to be the same people. They're just going to have each of those codes associated with them. And the reason for that is as you go through the procedures, you look at the code of who's responsible. Oh, that translates to this tech, to the level 1 engineer or the level 2 engineer or the operations manager or the tech director. And you know who's responsible for each component. And that's why this document is going to get fed down to even our junior technicians. Potentially even summer help are going to have to know a measure of this in order to help us live up to these policies. There's a couple of just general recommendations and things like that that we can add to or tweak. The sections on system hardening. It's just a lot of definitions and I wouldn't call it an inventory, but maybe just a list of available technology that we're using or that's sort of involved in everything we're doing. It's more of a reference appendix. We might add some things to this or remove some things, but this is not an overwhelming section. Then we get to our databases, couple things there, talks about like devices, mobile devices. It's more definitions in that section. And then it gets into this really funky part of, and it's the only word I could use for it is funky, part of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is really their approach to usernames and passwords and things like that, primarily usernames, because and this is probably where we'll have the most debate and how we want to implement this when we really get to it. And so I don't know that this is going to be a year one type thing, but when they get into their approach to user accounts, it's all based on least privilege necessary. And having multiple accounts. So a privileged user, the approach to that would be to add a P dot in front of their name. So I might have a regular account, Matthew.Orfici, but my privileged account to be able to do things on the network is P.Matthew.Orfici and things like that. Is it a headache? Yeah, you're gonna have to maintain 6 accounts for different things. Is it what the NIST cybersecurity framework, standard suggests? Yes. How do we decide where we want to live in there? Well, we determine what level of risk is acceptable and we identify it and we make it clear. And we may decide that, yeah, we're not going to do this for kindergartners. We may even not do it for administrators because they would flip out if they had to have 3 accounts, district administrators. But for our IT staff, we are going to do this. Wherever we veer off from the framework, we just have to identify it, document it, and acknowledge the risk, and then mention if there's anything we're doing to mitigate that risk. So it's not that we can't venture off. There's a realistic aspect of this that we just may not be the type of facility organization that can do each of these things. It doesn't necessarily fit into a school, but we have to acknowledge it and record that. So that's a component of maturing in this program. So it may not be that we have those kind of the document associated with acknowledged risk for each of these pieces may not be so mature yet. That may be something we build on, but at least initially, part of the risk assessment is identifying those things and being open about it. Not open to the public, so they know a vulnerability, but open among the team and whomever are the key stakeholders, even on the board. Maybe it's not the entire board that gets some of this information. Maybe it's a subcommittee. We don't know how that'll evolve, but that's a piece of this that we're going to want to identify. Just another thing so you get a little taste of it. There's sections on like groups and how that works, mailboxes. And then there's a glossary of the acronyms, so you can have fun with that, and some of the other terms. Every document in this, just like most policies and procedures, has a record of changes table at the end. And this is what we're going to want to have to maintain, because when we do get audited, we're going to want to show our change trail that shows everything that we've done, the log of updates to this, and the fact that even if we're not making any changes, that we're reviewing it often enough to be in compliance. Okay, so let's jump back now. So this is where we are now. Hopefully that mad dash run through of this helped you at least get a taste of what the documentation looks like and how it fits into the NIST cybersecurity framework. Again, 2 key documents that we're starting with. And I say starting with because it may be that the district wants to purchase another one of those templates that we talked about earlier. Maybe it's an incident response plan or a continuity of business operations plan. But our feeling is we don't necessarily have to do that now. One, because you may already have some documentation. When it comes to the incident response program, there's already procedures regarding incident response built into these 2 documents that we've discussed. Are they mature? Well, they could probably be bigger, the program, and that's why maybe you want to invest in another document down the road, or maybe we want to develop our own internally. Same thing with your disaster recovery and business continuity plans. What we have on the shelf already may at least be sufficient for day one. Our feeling is let's start with the core components, starting with the WISP document, which is those high-level policies. That just reviewing that document together educates everyone on what NIST requires of us. It also gives you a basis for what you might want to start in the way of professional development with staff, at least introducing them to some of the vernacular and the concepts associated with it. And as you go through those policies, you'll get a sense of what really will affect day-to-day staff and what may merit PD and what stuff they're never going to have to deal with. Like, are staff really going to destroy hard drives? No, they're really not part of that. So maybe you reference it, but you don't have to train them on it, things like that. The procedures portion of it is the piece that after we are all familiar with that WISP document, we're going to want to go through as a IT team. So that's going to be you, your operations manager, and at least the lead engineer at each site. And for some of your sites, you have staff now that are, maybe working with data. We provide some of your data services, so that they might be part of the team. But especially in some of our sites, we have hybrid staff now that are doing cybersecurity services. Like Laura, we talked about what Joe's going to be doing there in Hen HUD, helping with data, but also leveraging him for some of this piece of it. So he'll be part of those conversations as well. That's so that we have across the board, we're all kind of developing and maturing the documents together. So we went over it. We have a general sense of what we have now. The next step, and what we'd want to set up for a subsequent meeting over Zoom or however we want to do it, and we can do it again as a large group if everybody's okay with that, but it would be to start doing that cursory risk assessment based on a review of the documents. And my recommendation is starting with the WISP document and doing a cursory review of that. And what that would involve is a little bit of homework. It would mean familiarizing yourself, between now and then, whenever we decide to schedule it, with that WISP document, so that we can all kind of go through it, discuss what we believe each policy means, because there's some interpretation, but all really collectively. And I think that's where there's value working as a group, at least on that level, to identify those policies and how we think we might be living up to them now, or how we may not be living up to them, so that we can do an initial assessment of where we are. Then I would say start to peek at that other document. Don't bore yourself to death with it yet, but start to get a sense of the procedures that link up to those policies, so that you know what might be involved, as a kind of a next step. By doing that, I think we will all start to, there's no reason why we all, to a large extent, even our districts that may only have a 10-month tech director as opposed to a 12-month position, there's no reason why we couldn't have that WISP document, be familiar with it, and at least have an assessment of how much of it we understand and are doing now by the opening of school. And especially have at least some information that you could start using for professional development. That would, in my mind, that would be a great goal to have for September. However you end up doing PD, or it looks like, I say September because I know for most districts, they do a measure of PD at the end of August into September. I don't know what that's going to look like this year. You're probably trying to figure it out too. But even if it was October or whenever that looks like, some professional development for the new school year that touches on this, I think that would be a great goal and a reasonable goal. And by doing this, if we all have that WISP document on our shelf, and we understand it, and we know where we are kind of in the world of it, at least I feel, hopefully you agree, is a very good first step of living up to the best effort or best faith or good faith effort that the state of New York is requiring that you live up to when it comes to adopting the cybersecurity framework from NIST. It's show us your best effort. Well, if in 2 months we were able to get a core piece of it done and understood, well, we're light years ahead of a lot of places. Then going into the fall, what we want to work on is that procedures document, the CSOP document, where we really start getting into that. And we could do that sooner than later for the districts that want to move fast. But even if it's that we're not getting that there until the fall, I think that's reasonable, because that's going to start implementing how we do things. It might implement software that we buy or systems. A lot of our districts utilize or already starting to use some of the auditing tools that we have. That's going to be a big piece of this, having reports that we can run so that we can do assessments of it. And that's it. So I know I talked for an hour straight, which many of you know I can do quite easily, but I'll let you folks can unmute yourself if you have a question or have a comment, any thoughts on it.
Matt, I have a question. It's Deborah. I thought you keep talking about PD, in my district, I'm the tech department. So I don't have to worry about my staff. It's your staff. That's the only staff I have.
Okay.
But for teachers and that staff, teacher aide staff, that staff, I thought we only had to make them familiar with the Ed Law 2D compliance pieces of a general understanding of the basic NIST framework, and then focus more on student privacy and board policy. That would be my whole PD, which is much more higher level than any of this stuff. It is the basic NIST framework, but it's very generic. Is there something I'm missing?
No, I agree with you there. I just think that as much as there's the 2/3 of this whole Ed Law 2D is all of the data privacy things and where the bulk of your PD is going to be. The NIST framework is such a big, even though it's like one line in the Ed Law, it's like, yeah, you should adopt this. It may involve a lot of change and awareness on the part of all staff. And I think there's a value to at least touching on it with staff. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to study each of these pieces. That's why I said, and I think I'm showing it on the screen now. the appendix of that WISP document just has just the policies and the intent. My guess is that there may be pieces of this that you're just going to ignore with staff, like your cryptography policy, but there may be pieces of it that you do want to share just on a slide when you're doing cybersecurity training each year with them. And maybe you're introducing them to pieces of it because it's going to at least make them aware of why we're asking them to do certain things differently. You know, when we ask someone to have 3 different login accounts potentially, and I'm not saying that's always gonna be the case, but say we're doing that, it's good for them to understand why. Because again, there's living up to what the state is asking us to do, which is the initial, demand of this, but there's also the value to having a mature cybersecurity program. And we all know that the biggest risk in the entire cybersecurity program are the users, the rank and file users, and those that are the least aware of why and how things work. So anything we can do to make them at least aware of the program we have in place and why we're doing it, I think is going to be valuable. And we'll be able to, when you show what training you're doing, when it comes to maybe a compliance audit or an assessment, I think it's going to add some weight to it as opposed to just telling people, more generic things. So we want to be high level, but I think, every so often without them realizing it, feeding in a little more mature food, we want to move them from milk to solid food in this case. I think that's going to be valuable, at least on that level. So I don't know, hopefully that helps a little bit, Deva.
Thanks.
Caitlin, you had a question about recommended names or positions. Do you want to just?
I have a question.
I was just thinking about as we fill out this document, I'm always hesitant to put someone's name versus the title of a position because when employees come and go, if the document is not updated, how often are we doing that? And so I was just wondering if the recommendation is, should it be the director of technology or should it be Caitlin Sassone? Is it more position based?
I think what you could do if you're concerned about it is use generic roles. And that's sort of what they're already doing. Like if I go to that document, if I go to the CSOP, which I had here, if I go to those roles, they're already doing some of that with, I'm sorry, let me jump down to it. Here you go. They have kind of categories and things like that. And then they have the work role and then an ID for it. What could easily be done is creating another page where we take, all of these and they're this role based on our team structure. Level 1 system engineer A, tech director. Then we could have another page that's just the names. And then it's one page. If we have a change in staff, we should be changing that. That's part of the process. We want to make it as quick as possible, not have to change it in 15 places. But I think we could easily do that by adding a page to this that makes those links. Does that make sense? Oh, good. Any other questions? I think we hit our hour mark. So what I'm going to do is I'll take the recording and make it available to everybody. I know a number of districts were looking to purchase the set of documents. If you need a new quote, just let me know or let your OM know. We also have on the call with us today, Dan Caravella, who's our new director of sales, who's, for as much as it says director of sales, he's not a salesy guy. He's more helping us really ensure that when we do projects with you, we see them to kind of completion from beginning to end and kind of expediting that process. So I have him with us today, just so everybody got a chance to see him there. He's waving.
Hi, Dan.
I tried not to pin his video. You know what? We'll just pin his video up there so that everybody will spotlight Dan. Hi, Dan.
Once we're able to get out there, you'll be able to see me.
So you'll see Dan as he works with the OMs. He's really going to be an asset to your OMs and helping to facilitate like projects and things. And so I just wanted to introduce him today because even with this, everything we do is going to touch cybersecurity and living within the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so that's why we want as many at least involved or aware of the process. And then we'll start getting into the nitty gritty of it. So as you mentioned—
Matt, I got another question.
Go for it,
I'm sorry.
Hey, no, you're good.
I always have another question.
Yep.
So we have the policies and protocols that we put into effect 10 years ago, whatever, that you very kindly wrote for us and we adapted to our district. In response to Caitlin's question, I still have my old superintendent's names in there. I mean, and he's long gone. But which is why I also don't like using names, because the old staff names are all through that document and we've never updated it other than a page here, a page there for policy, but we never went back to the staff pieces and updated that, which is really a bear. But now that we're going to this WISP document, and are we phasing out? I know there's pieces in there that we can pull right into these new documents eventually. Should we just let that sit? Should I be going back and updating those people that were in that document with the correct names for today? Should I just leave it alone and eventually we'll
I would leave it alone. I would put it on the shelf, and what we're going to use it for is a area to copy and paste from or print and put as an appendix to these new documents, because the point is we need to have documentation that aligns with NIST. And just to give you one other example of that real briefly, this is a spreadsheet that you'll get from Compliance Forge when you buy any documents from them. And it's impossible to read because there's so much on it. I'll try to zoom in, but it shows you their policies, the target audience, but it also goes into, as I scroll to the right, all of the frameworks and standards that it corresponds to or cross-references. So you'll see, like in our case, we're mostly concerned about this. But our old documentation doesn't do that. And it would take us so long to go through and map all of our old procedures. As much as some of them are not going to change, a lot of these procedures, we were doing them and we had them documented. But to go back and try to cross-reference all of them would be a nightmare. So it's easier to start with documentation that's cross-referenced already for us. And if anything, we just start, if there's stuff we have to tweak, copy and paste from that old document. The names, again, with the way and this is what's nice about their documentation, they don't put names throughout the documents like maybe we used to. They just have work role IDs. So all we have to do, to what Caitlin was mentioning before, is maybe maintain one page where we have a name and all the IDs that they represent or that they're responsible for. And it's just one page, but it then disseminates out to all of these other documents, wherever those IDs are used. So I think that'll make life a little easier. And that's part of the homework that we'll work on to get the procedures document, mature. I mean, there's no reason why we couldn't do a good portion of the procedures document for September if everybody wanted to. I'm just trying to measure it, based on what I know everybody else has going on for summer and not knowing what school's going to look like in September. So my thought is, if at least we get everyone familiar with the WISP and everybody familiar enough in a way that serves also as a bit of a assessment of where we are with it, I think that's a valuable thing to go into September with. And then we get right into this document with the text, spending time weekly or, twice a month, just really digging into this and starting to associate, components and changing procedures where we feel like we can, planning to change procedures where it's a little more of, requires some training or implementation, budgeting for systems that maybe we may need to change or implement, that kind of thing. And I think that's will take us through the next 12 months with the idea that, okay, we want to at least get far enough in this to know what stuff will affect our budget for 21-22. So you'll need that information by the winter, by December, the latest probably. And each year we'll continue to mature further and further and further. I don't know if I have it here, but we'll on our next call with this, I'll share another little infographic that talks about that process of maturing in your program, with the goal of, okay, there's getting everything in place, and eventually your maturity gets to a point where you're not just have the procedures in place, you're living up to them, but now you're assessing them, like true assessment and performance assessments, and then eventually to a point where you're actually like a full evolution of the program where you're actually making positive changes, not just to live up to it, but to improve it. And that's where we ultimately want to get. But that's likely a multi-year process to do it right. And that's what we just want to help everyone to bite off what they can chew.
Matt, can I ask a question? It's Sabrina.
Yeah, Sabrina.
So since we're like a large consortium of different schools, instead of every single one of us coming up with our own language, is there going to be like a crowdsourced document that we can borrow and steal from?
Well, the point of this is that this is already written. So there's not much that has to be rewritten in this, with the exception of, like we said, maybe we come up with a page that's workable for everybody and we would just share it. That's like how to associate names with these roles. That's an easy thing to share. Again, the work with it is, and this is where working together is helpful from the standpoint of kind of reading through, all sort of agreeing on what we believe this to mean when it says to do something a certain way. But it's more going to be highlighting the things we're not doing and determining how do we want to get there. But the procedure is actually written. There's not a whole lot that needs to be rewritten. It is what it is.
So when we get this, is it going to be like a PDF fillable that we know where we're supposed to insert?
It comes as a Word doc. And that's where we'll work with you together. And that's where I thought we'd work together on like making it specific, like, okay, we should all fill in this section. This is what needs to be filled in, and go through it. But it's mostly going to be going through this document almost with a red line and highlighting it, with 3 different highlighters and hiding things we want to hide. And this is where each district might be a little different, because some districts may be a little further ahead in one component, but further behind in another. And that'll be the process, but it's written. There's not a lot in here, and that's what's nice about it. And makes sense because it's a standard. The standard sort of dictates what you have to do. So there's not a lot of wiggle room. The wiggle room comes down to if you flat out are not going to do something, that's where we may have to work. I think where there'll be room to work together more. And like you said, having like standard language for, there may be components in this that none of us are going to do, or none of us are doing right now, or none of us will do in the near future, just because it's so odd for a school environment that we may all agree that this is the paragraph we want in our document that references the risk, why, and everything else. That's where I think it'll be helpful working together and all be on the same page. Because then if we get audited and we all get audited, at least we're all saying the same thing, telling the same story. So does that make sense, Sabrina? I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I mean, but you could almost take this document and throw it on the shelf and hand it to an auditor. And we did that in the nursing home that we maintain in Manhattan, who I've mentioned it to some of you. They actually, some of the nursing homes now, because they are involved in like retirement communities, they actually fall under not just Department of Health, but Department of Financial Services, because they're treated almost like an insurance company or an investment. So they have a much higher, they're like towards the middle of that infographic of weak to strong cybersecurity programs. We went through Compliance Forge, got the documents that fit those, standards and frameworks that they have to meet. And before even, filling anything out, we sent it for an assessment basically and said, here's what we have. What do you think? And they were like, this is pretty good. And that was with literally just the name of the nursing home on it. So the documents, it's nice because they're pretty well written. The problem is if you do that, if you just put your name on it, put it on the shelf, we really didn't accomplish anything, because you need to understand it. And that's really the process of going through the documents. So for as much as we didn't write it, we want to make it our own by really understanding it. I think that's the key process. So it's not a lot of typing, it's more reading in this process.
Matt, sorry, quick question. It's Caitlin. Do you suggest when we kind of make our own legend for our risk assessments that we do it individually and then go through it with our OM, or do it together so we're on the same page in terms of how we're coding things? Or
my thought was maybe to do at least one more session all together if everyone's available, or however we have to do it, because maybe there's a value in at least doing that together or starting to do it together, because I think there's value in everyone's respective backgrounds and expertise to have a good approach to that. I don't want to just make a suggestion and say, this is how you should do it. I think there's a value to your collective experience and knowledge to that piece of it, especially because it's your neck on the line. So we want it to be your risk assessment. We want you to feel comfortable with the approach to it. So I think if at least that's my goal for the next session that we plan, would be to start that process together. Hopefully those districts that are able to, use this documentation, we had 5 or 6 already do it. We have a few others that we're just waiting till July 1 to be able to purchase it. So if we'd scheduled something maybe like 2 weeks out or something, I know some are gone for the summer, but if they're available for an hour or so, I'm happy to do it whenever. And even if we have to do more than one, the same session, I think just going through that process of starting it, we might collectively come up with hey, here's the right approach to it. I was joking around. I said 3 colors of highlighter. Maybe there's 5, it's just however we kind of code it. Because then if we regroup again to do another session, I think that'll be helpful, because we may find that we overlap in a lot of places with the things that either we're doing well or that we're not doing at all. And I think that will help us with collectively, even putting a measure of weight on each of those assessments, like which ones are critical, which ones are low-hanging fruit that we could just knock out, because that's another piece of it too. So does everyone feel like they'd want to do maybe at least one more session altogether for about an hour? Is that overwhelming? Or I got some thumbs up, some nods. Some nods, good. Okay, great. So what I'll do is I'll email everyone just to get a sense of where they think they'll be, maybe in 2 weeks. And then for the districts that we're waiting for July 1, I think that would put us in a window, maybe 2.5 weeks, something like that. But at least having a July meeting. I'm open to conducting as many of these as we need to do over the summer. And the point would be that we'll then continue on into the school year with it, and make it a regular thing. Once we have mature programs, it may be that we're doing a quarterly thing and we're just kind of reviewing it, and everybody's sort of, talking about what they're using for different pieces. And but this is now part of our life, so we just have to accept it. Very good. Well, thank you so much. Sorry, we went a few minutes over, but I really appreciated the questions too. Were really helpful, I think.
This is great. Thank you, Matt.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, folks.